Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
We'll be talking about the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Graham Mooney about epidemics and scapegoating and what historical precedents from past epidemics can teach us about the current coronavirus pandemic. Freddie, getting to this question of the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're seeing now, countries around the world are enforcing strict confinement rules to contain the spread of the virus. Others are preparing to do so. And as a result, economies are grinding to a halt in real time, leaving individual workers, businesses, and in some cases, entire sectors suddenly at risk.
It's a sudden and pretty startling hit to the economy. I guess it shouldn't necessarily be surprising since, all indications since the shutdowns, lockdowns were put in place here, on the East Coast in the United States. We're into the second week. This is really what everyone was warning was coming. If anything, the unemployment figures that were just released this morning, something like 3.3 million Americans who filed for unemployment just in the last week or so, shattering by many times the previous record in U.S. history. There's some indications that was actually a little bit lower than what some people expected. But I don't really think you can overstate the economic impact right now and just how uncharted it is.
I saw Kevin Drum, who I read regularly, raise this question of what we can even call what the economies of the world will be going through. Certainly it's a recession and possibly even a depression, but it's almost self-induced in the sense that it's a result of the public health measures that have been taken rather than some sort of external shock or something wrong in the actual economy itself. In any case, the impact is very stark and, as you said, very sudden. Over the past few weeks, everyone has had a chance to sort of digest and think about this idea of essential versus non-essential work, people who can work remotely versus those who can't. And we've discussed it in various ways in the past few episodes of the podcast. But at the same time, what you see now is the real impact in real lives and in people's lives and livelihoods of what it means to be a non-essential worker, to not be able to work remotely, and to have entire sectors like the restaurant and cafe sector, the airline sector, hotels, things like that, really decimated in suspended animation. Now, the assumption is that if the virus went away tomorrow and people could go about their daily lives normally, that those industries and those jobs will still be there. But of course, that's obviously not going to happen. And so we just ran an in-depth article this week by Dan McDowell about the government responses in terms of these shocks that have hit the economies of the world. And one of the things that Dan pointed out is that compared to, for instance, the response to the global financial crisis in 2008, that the response this time has been big and fast. In terms of the rescue packages in the U.S. and Europe, the policymakers have moved more quickly. They've delivered bigger packages. But as Dan explains, the current crisis adds a whole other third element to be considered, which is sustainability, simply because we don't know how long these conditions will last or will have to last.
It's the sort of central problem here, and I mean, it might even be something of a contradiction where what's needed immediately is, historically large rescue packages, disaster relief, Some of what has happened in the U.S. is a bailout of many industries, including the airline industry, apparently. And we've seen similar steps being taken in countries all over the world that are trying to deal with the economic impact of this pandemic. But what Dan pointed out, and what you're getting at too, is that it's this challenge of even a historically large amount of money, whether it's $1 trillion or $2 trillion spread out across the economy, distributed in different ways. It's a question of how long is that going to last, and how sustainable is it? And as Dan pointed out, and as many other experts have pointed out already, even the largest bailout in U.S. history, which is what apparently this rescue package will be, is not going to be enough to sustain the economy here in the U.S. For the full extent of this pandemic, based on all the projections for how long things could continue to spread here in the U.S. and how much longer these shelter-in-place orders or restrictions on people's movement to try to contain the virus's spread, how long those are going to be needed. And so there's already this problem that it may be big and it may be swift, but you're going to have to do it again, and maybe again after that. And not only is there a question of can governments afford to do that, but also, more importantly, I think, is there the political will to do it? I mean, I think the question of what the U.S. can afford is ultimately always just a political argument, because it's, the richest country on earth. It ultimately can afford really whatever it wants to. It's, spending has never really reined in, for example, the U.S. military budget or other key areas that have been national priorities. And I think we're seeing that already, in this stimulus package that is apparently going to get passed by Congress by the end of the week. But it's probably not going to be enough. And this great unknown is how much worse the pandemic will get and what things will look like in a few weeks, let alone a few months. And so there's these economic solutions to what is a public health crisis, and the way to get the economy ultimately back is to deal with the public health crisis, and that's a medical response, not an economic response.
Now, just to backtrack a little bit, so far in the rescue packages that we've seen, whether in the UK or France, Germany, the US, they've basically been designed to satisfy three major urgent requirements. One is to replace lost income for individuals, whether it's through unemployment benefits in the U.S. or guaranteed basic income, or even if it's not called that, just a government guarantee that lost incomes will be replaced up to a certain proportion of the regular income, and then rescue packages, bailouts essentially, to keep heavily affected businesses and sectors afloat. And finally, central banks that have just sought to reassure financial markets that liquidity and financing won't dry up, that they'll print the money essentially. So you have these three components for individuals, business sectors, and just financial markets to keep things from freezing up the way they did in the aftermath of the financial crisis. The one thing that I'd point out is that you refer to it as a stimulus package. It's really a rescue package, because it's not really stimulating growth or stimulating recovery right now. It's essentially staunching the bleeding and trying to just put a bandage on the wound. And as you said, there's no real we just don't know how long that will be required. I agree that, and again, I'm not an expert in global markets or macroeconomics. I agree that the U.S. and other European countries can afford to do this in an immediate sense, and it does, in some ways, show some of the cynicism that was at play, for instance, during the European debt crisis, when austerity was imposed on countries that were going through debt crises that eventually mutated in humanitarian crises in countries like Greece, which had to decimate its public health system, for instance, with austerity budgets. And at the time, everyone said, "Well, there's no money for it, and we can't go into debt like that." And now, obviously, the circumstances are obviously very different, but governments are showing a willingness to do that for now. Clearly, there will be macroeconomic impacts after things get back to whatever semblance of normal they do. And there's no real way of knowing what those will be. But the understanding and the consensus among most of the economists that I've read is that that's a secondary consideration. And right now you just do what you have to do to make sure that people have enough money to buy the necessities that they'll need over the course of the next few weeks and months, and that there is an economy to go back to in the aftermath. I guess one thing that really jumps out in terms of the government responses so far, the biggest piece that's missing is any sort of multilateral component, similar to what we saw in the aftermath of the financial crisis when the G20 became a major institution for coordinating, a major forum and format for coordinating the global response. It almost seems like there's a perfect storm right now of obstacles to that kind of cooperation and coordination. You have a U.S. administration that's hostile to multilateralism, that's been skeptical of the significance of the pandemic from the beginning. You have an EU that's been riven by divisions in the run-up to the pandemic, seems to be finding its footing a little bit, but had some trouble getting there in terms of responding to the pandemic. And then as for the G20, the leaders of the G20 held a video conference today. It's not terribly reassuring to see that conference chaired by King Salman of Saudi Arabia, who, according to a lot of reporting, is not necessarily in full total control of his faculties at all times.
No, I mean that, and also just the visual of I saw pictures of computer screenshots of every world leader sitting in their respective office or situation room equivalent, effectively on a video chat with 19 other world leaders, and it just sends home the message for even further that everybody is isolated, trying to limit exposure and spread of the virus. There's something the sort of connection of seeing a prime minister or president. Obviously they're still dressed in a suit or whatever, but there's a slight sense of more casualness.
You mean to say you're not wearing one, Freddy?
Right, exactly. We got to keep up our work etiquette. But no, it's not reassuring at all. And just a few other developments that we underscoring this point in the last couple of days. The G7 has argued apparently among itself about a statement of cooperation about the pandemic, that there were conflicting statements because the U.S. delegation led by Mike Pompeo insisted on calling it the Wuhan coronavirus, and other G7 members rejected that, so they couldn't even come to an agreement on a unified statement about the virus. And in the UN Security Council, similarly, there's apparently a back and forth about the U.S. delegation insisting on language in a UN statement effectively blaming China for the pandemic. China has its own, interests at play. They want the statement from the UN to effectively credit China for its great response to the coronavirus after the outbreak there. So I think, it's a time of increased competition between the U.S. and China, but especially with an administration in Washington that has spent years, scorning even the idea of international cooperation. They're not about to change their tune now.
I remember when Ronald Reagan was president, and I'm not sure if these are apocryphal stories or not, but I remember reading at one of his summits with Mikhail Gorbachev in discussing nuclear weapons, turning to Gorbachev and saying, if extraterrestrials attacked the United States, we wouldn't be training our weapons on each other. We'd be joining forces to fight them off. Apparently, Gorbachev, from what I read, was a little taken aback because it seemed a little far-fetched for the U.S. president to be using that as an argument for arms control. But in any case, here we have a situation where it's not an extraterrestrial; it's a virus that's threatening the entire world, and you'd think that you would see the kind of cooperation and coordination, not just in the public health response, but in the economic response. But as you said, it seems like it's heading more down the road toward acrimony than cooperation. Just for now, I'd add. I think that the important thing to remember is that I think we're in a very early part of this entire crisis, as shocking as it is, and as traumatic as it has been, and as big a transformation that it's forced us all to enact in terms of how we're living. I think we're in the early part of it, and that the big components that are missing right now is reliable data and information on the spread of the virus, as well as its behavior, because at that point we'll have much better ideas of how long this kind of self-confinement will be required, and whether it will be periodically necessary moving forward or not. But I think that it really does. There's a lot of uncertainty and unknown. And I think that it does raise this question of the balance to be struck between addressing the public health crisis and staving off a potential systemic crisis in terms of an economic or societal breakdown, both of which would have very serious public health consequences as well. And obviously, when you see President Trump make the kinds of declarations he's made over the past week, where he's talking about America being back open for business by Easter, it's obviously not based on any of the expert advice or the medical advice. And in his own way, or as he often does, Trump is finding the most stupid way to raise a serious question. But it is a serious question. When a health crisis like this forces such a shift in behavior and in our lives that it poses a potential existential threat to the economic structure and the economic order, it puts us in a very, very difficult position for obvious reasons in terms of balancing those equities and figuring out the best way to go, especially given how much uncertainty there is in terms of the length of the confinement that we'll be forced to engage in, and the outcomes.
Right. I mean, Trump's problem, sort of keeping in character, is that he's in the last handful of days, that the way that he consistently talks about the economy and about dealing with the pandemic, is setting up this false choice that there's somehow the question of we save the economy or we follow these draconian restrictions to limit the spread of the virus, which he suggests are, overstated. He's suggesting that, it's sort of the doctor's call that they want to do this no matter what it means for the economy. But, putting that aside, it doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate question and questions to be raised about the balance over, how you maintain the public health measures that you have to maintain to limit the spread while also trying to plan for, cushioning, at least if you can, the economic impact. And I think what really underscored that was an interview we ran this week with Bruce Mann, who is an expert on disaster preparedness. He used to run the British Cabinet Office's Civil Contingencies Secretariat. So he was essentially in charge of the UK government's planning and response to emergencies and disasters. And he was asked directly what issue keeps him up at night right now regarding COVID-19. And he's currently advising other governments since he's no longer working for the British government. And his response was very straightforward. the economy and unemployment, no question. So I think it's a reminder that even for public health experts and even for experts who deal with a whole range of disasters and emergencies, and that this is a sort of unparalleled one, the economic question should necessarily be part of it. It doesn't mean that it sets up this false equivalency or this choice of one over the other. It should be really understood as part of the same problem, that they're one and the same.
I think also what's been emerging and becoming increasingly clear to me over the course of the past few weeks, and it was obvious and in the early responses to the pandemic, even before we really had a sense of where things were headed, and it just started to become increasingly clear that basically social distancing and avoiding social contact was going to be the central component of stopping the spread of the virus. There was a lot of questioning of why not do it right away, or why not postpone it, or things like that. And it became obvious to me that we think of these decisions as medical, technical decisions, but they really are political decisions. There are lives at stake, but it's not the only time that there are lives at stake when it comes to political decisions. When a government decides to go to war, or even short of going to war, maybe engaging in airstrikes against another country, or things like that, lives are at stake. It's a political decision. It's a cost to benefit analysis of what interests outweigh other interests. Even when it comes to budgeting in a national budget, in a governmental budget, between, for instance, the military and healthcare, the military and education. Other things, the military is obviously very, very explicit, but there are other more implicit choices that are made that have life and death outcomes. And so this one is so dramatic and so stark because of what we're seeing, for instance, in Italy and Spain, where you have countries that are not used to this, right? This is so it's such a shock to countries and to people in countries who are used to thinking of themselves and their societies and their countries as rich countries, comfortable countries, advanced countries, where medical systems can treat diseases, and that right there puts into sharp contrast the ways in which all of us in the developed economies and the developed countries, we think that way about ourselves, but we kind of take for granted that we're going to read stories about epidemics in poorer countries, less developed countries, or civil wars, where hundreds of thousands or millions of people might die over the course of a decade or shorter, or be displaced. The suffering in Syria is an obvious example. South Sudan, the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, and suddenly those decisions. And those two, whether or not we intervene, are political decisions. And suddenly those political decisions are much closer to home. And so obviously when anything's closer to home, it has a much greater impact and it focuses our attention a lot more, obviously. But again, this is a political decision of balancing the costs and the benefits and the interests and the equities between stopping the virus, the public health aspects of that, the public health aspects of maintaining an economy, because there are some, and the societal aspects of maintaining an economy. I don't think there are any easy answers, and certainly not as much as a lot of people on either side of the argument portray it.
No, and I think that even we're sort of seeing in a funny way how there isn't even really the terminology and the language to really describe fully what is happening. I mean, to bring it back to the point you mentioned about, the relief package that is going to be passed here in the U.S. is not really a stimulus package, even though some politicians have called it that. Some newspapers and other media outlets have called it that, because I think that's sort of the familiar frame of reference that, if the federal government's injecting hundreds of billions of dollars into different parts of the economy, trying to prop up businesses. That's stimulus, quote unquote. But, at a time when the economy is essentially frozen because, large parts of the country are at home, what it really is it's, as you said, it's a rescue package. It's disaster relief. It's really social services, or trying to provide a social safety net, at least in terms of the unemployment benefits, the direct payments that are going to go to many Americans. But it's still a question of, it's also being called a bailout because it does have huge amounts of money for, the airline industry and other businesses. That term in and of itself is a political term in the U.S. because Republicans don't want to call it a bailout. They opposed the Obama administration's, emergency measures to deal with the financial crisis because that was, quote, a bailout. So I think that even the terminology of what we're seeing is it's a situation where huge amounts of money, historically large amounts of money from governments are needed to try to at least cushion the impact of the pandemic economically. But they're not the kind of measures that are going to, juice the economy and see a bunch of economic activity. People aren't going to go out and spend their money because, this is all happening because of a pandemic where everyone is trying to limit their social contact to limit the spread of the virus. So, I think that we're already seeing that there isn't really even the sort of political language to really describe what's happening.
And I think, I agree. It's these are almost like bridge loans or bridge grants for these industries and these businesses to get through a period of suspended activity, essentially. Again, there's been a lot of gestures of solidarity within communities and among individuals. We've seen that on a national scale. In the UK, for instance, they called for volunteers for the National Health Service to help on things like delivering medications or doing non-specialized tasks, and 500,000 people signed up in a period of days. So I don't want to paint too dark a picture of everything that's going on. And the truth is that the governments that have acted and the central banks that have acted, as Dan pointed out, we'll see if it's enough over time, but they acted with historically massive rescue packages on all those three levels: the individuals, the businesses and business sectors, and then in terms of the financial markets, to make sure that things don't seize up and we see a 2008 on steroids at the worst possible moment. So for now, the governments have shown political will to do what's necessary in the immediate term. Again, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of the length of time that we'll be dealing with this, and that could be more positive than negative for all we know. I've seen a modeling, a new modeling study that suggests that many more people have already been infected by the virus, and so that suggests we might not be at the beginning of the actual spread, but more toward the middle and approaching a point where more people are immune to it than not. And so the immediate crisis that we're facing right now in terms of overwhelmed healthcare services could be the end of the acute phase of the crisis. Again, there's no way of knowing right now because we just don't have the data. But there are some positive developments there in terms of antibody tests that are being developed and more cheaper and faster tests for if people are actually infected with the virus. So for now, what we know is that governments have stepped up in the immediate response, and that hopefully between that and the heroic efforts in terms of the frontline health workers, we'll be able to weather the storm until we do manage to get the kind of data information that we need.
Yeah, as you stressed, ultimately what is lacking most of all still is data and information, and the decisions that governments have made in terms of how seriously they have taken the pandemic, and then now the economic crisis that it's created, does suggest that they have enough information to act and to have the political will to act, but they're also still, in some ways, all of us are sort of in the dark because there just isn't enough reliable data.
All right. Time to get to some WPR articles we want to mention for everyone. Which one did you have in mind?
In non-coronavirus news, a briefing by Jim Crane on the U.S. Shale oil industry and how it led to a breakdown in Russian-Saudi relations. It provides a lot of interesting context for the oil price war that was launched by Saudi Arabia at probably the worst time possible, just as the pandemic was hitting. But Jim provides some very revealing backstory about how the U.S. shale industry interfered with what had sort of been a working relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia when it came to the oil markets.
And also in non-COVID-19 content, I'll mention a briefing co-authored by Melissa McEwen, Tiago Hector Kanashiro Uehara, I hope I'm getting his last name correctly, and Christopher Sabatini on a recent diplomatic spat between France and Brazil over the wildfires that destroyed a vast amount of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest last summer. The deforestation of the Amazon has long been a source of tension between Brazil, which considers the rainforest a sovereign resource to be exploited, and Western developed countries, which see it as the planet's biggest carbon sink. Those tensions have been amplified in recent years by the heightened urgency of the climate crisis, and Chris and his co-authors explain why both sides share part of the blame for the problem and propose a potential solution, expanding the UNESCO system of protected sites to include a designation for climate stabilization. It's a creative solution for a problem that might seem a little less urgent under the current circumstances, but which will take on all its importance once the coronavirus pandemic is behind us. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, Freddy, time for Who Said That? What do you got for me?
To be honest with you, I think these numbers right now are not relevant, whether they are bigger or smaller in the short term.
I do not know. I wonder if it's referring to testing for the coronavirus?
Actually, I was going to mention it in our discussion because it's related to the economy. This was Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin in a cable news interview very soon after the jobless figures were released, the historic jump in jobless claims. And Mnuchin was trying to sell the impact of the relief package and essentially saying that these 3.3 million new jobless claims are not relevant. I'm sure he's going to try to clean them up later, clean up that claim.
A little tone deaf. I did read, in all fairness, some good reviews of the work he did in terms of negotiating the package through the Senate, in terms of negotiating with the Democratic and Republican leadership in the Senate. But yeah, that particular remark, he might want to walk back. Okay, here's mine. It'll be obvious what it's about. The points here are for knowing who or what entity actually said it. So here's the quote. "We're imposing a curfew because nobody is taking this seriously. Whoever is in the street screwing around or going for a walk will receive a corrective and serve as an example. Better to stay home doing nothing. The message has been given."
Is this from somewhere in Italy? Maybe a mayor of a town in Italy?
It's a good guess because I've seen some of the subtitled videos of local mayors castigating their constituents. But no, it's actually a recorded message that, according to press reports, is being broadcast from moving vehicles driving through Rio de Janeiro's City of God favela. The message is coming from the local criminal gangs that essentially govern those favelas. The vast slum recorded its first case of COVID-19 over the weekend.
The videos that I've seen of various Italian mayors and other local politicians are amazing. There's not many times that you'll see a mayor, shouting at a kid who's out playing soccer or something and tell him to go home and play video games.
It's one of the lighthearted moments, I guess, in my evening surfing, the videos that pop up on Twitter and social media. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.